And I'm going to quote, not from a creationist or not from a believing Christian scientist. We're going to quote from one of the leading atheists in the world today, Richard Dawkins, okay, who wrote a book called The God Delusion. It's a bestseller, sold millions. It's been translated, I think, into 30 languages. He is the high priest of atheism today, Richard Dawkins. This is what he writes about the DNA, the genetic material. After Watson and Crick, who were the people who discovered DNA, we know that genes themselves are living strings, listen carefully, of pure digital information. What is more, they are truly digital in the full and strong sense of computers and compact disks. The machine code of the genes is uncannily computer-like. Apart from differences in jargon, the pages of a molecular biology journal might be interchanged with those of a computer engineering journal. Our genetic system, which is the universal system for all life on the planet, is digital to the core. DNA characters are copied with an accuracy that rivals anything modern engineers can do. DNA messages are pure digital code. I'm going to quote Dr. Paul Davies, who is an atheist, a physicist, an expert in origin of life. He says almost the same thing. In a living organism, we see the power of software. Listen to the terms they're using. Or information processing refined to an incredible degree. The problem of the origin of life reduces to one of understanding how encoded software emerged spontaneously from hardware. How did it happen? How did nature go digital? And finally, Bill Gates, from his book, The Road Ahead. DNA is like a computer program, but far, far more advanced than any software we've ever created. In other words, for though I don't know if the people who are involved in computers, in the DNA, which by the way, there's no such thing as primitive DNA. The DNA of the simplest bacterium works on this exact same code as our DNA. Obviously, it's a different code, and because our DNA produces us, and their DNA produces a bacterium. But the coding is exactly the same. It's just like, it doesn't matter which Windows program you're using, the operating program is all the same. So that's what he means when it says it's a universal digital code. Now I want you to keep something in mind. We didn't even know what digital code was until a few decades ago. Somebody knew about it 3.5 billion years ago, okay, when the first bacterium emerged. We're going to go on that assumption that we're going to deal with the standard scientific model that life emerged about 3.5 billion years ago on the Earth, okay? And the simplest, like I said, the simplest life forms that they've ever found are these bacteria, cyanobacteria. So that's number one. But what about the cell itself? That's the genetic code in the cell. What about the actual cell itself? Okay? I'm going to read to you also I'm going to bear with me as I read. I want you to understand what we're talking about when we're talking about trying to figure out how do you go from inorganic chemicals to living organisms. This is again Dr. Paul Davies and Dr. Michael Denton. These are not creationists. These are not people who advocate intelligent design theory. And I just want anyone to know, I don't quote anyone in my book, any scientist in the book, who is a proponent of those theories. Only people who are either atheists, agnostics, against intelligent design theory, those are the people that I use. I don't need to have people agree with me. I'm going to show you the people who disagree with me what they say. So this is Dr. Paul Davies and Dr. Michael Denton, who is an Australian microbiologist. The living cell is the most complex system of its size known to mankind. Its host of specialized molecules execute a dance of exquisite fidelity, orchestrated with breathtaking precision. How can mindless molecules, capable of only pushing and pulling their immediate neighbors, cooperate to form something as ingenious as a living organism? Scientists have fabricated invisible cogwheels, motors the size of a pinhead, and electrical switches as tiny as individual molecules. The burgeoning field of nanotechnology, building structures and devices measured on a scale of billions of a meter, promises to revolutionize our lives. But we should not lose sight of the fact that nature got there first. The world is already full of nanomachines. They are called living cells. Each cell is packed with tiny structures that might have come straight from an engineer's manual. Minuscule tweezers, scissors, pumps, motors, levers, valves, pipes, chains, and even vehicles abound. Although the tiniest living things known to science, bacterial cells, are incredibly small. Each is a veritable micro-miniaturized factory containing thousands of elegantly designed pieces of intricate molecular machinery made up altogether of 100,000 million atoms, far more complicated than any machine built by man and without parallel in the non-living world. Listen carefully. This is maybe the most fantastic thing of all. However, it would be a factory which would have one capacity not equaled in any of our own advanced machines, for it would be capable of replicating its entire structure within a matter of hours. Let me explain to you what that means. It means we have machines that make replications. What are they called? Xerox machine. You go in, you get a piece of, you get your bank statement, you put it on the Xerox machine, and now I have 2 copies of my bank statement, and now I have 2 copies showing me how much money I don't have. But imagine going into a Xerox machine, right? Throwing into the room all the raw materials that go into, like some plastic, some wires, and et cetera, et cetera. You come back in an hour, 2 Xerox machines. The one Xerox machine created another Xerox machine. That's what self-replication means. We don't have any clue how to do such a thing. That goes on millions and millions of times a day within our body. That's what's happening here. The question remains, how did I get there? And it's interesting that a man like Richard Dawkins, and again I keep referring to him because he is the leader of this whole new it's called militant atheism movement. He writes in his book, The God Delusion, he says like this: Darwinian evolution proceeds merrily once life has originated. But how does life get started? He asked the question too, right? I say, yeah, you're right, Professor Dawkins. How does life get started? So let's see what some of the, and actually Dawkins, it says, look, I'm a biologist. You know, that's not my area of expertise, but I'm sure the chemists will come up with an answer. This is essentially what he says. Let's ask the chemists. Let's ask the experts in origin of life research, how did life begin? Well, Dr. Stuart Kauffman. Dr. Stuart Kauffman is an atheist, a secular humanist, highly distinguished scientist at the Vermont Center for, what's it called? The Vermont Center, Vermont's Complex Systems Center. He writes like this. He's pretty straightforward. And by the way, you should know that the origin of life scientists are very open about this. It's not publicized, but it's very, very open. Stuart Kauffman. We do not, in fact, know how or where life started. There are several alternative views how life emerged on Earth, none established. Clearly, none of the theories above is adequate. And he goes even further. He says, anyone who tells you that he or she knows how life started on the Earth 3.5 billion years ago is a fool or a knave. Okay? Dr. Paul Davies. What stands out as the central unsolved puzzle in the scientific account of life is how the first microbe came to exist. How did something so immensely complicated, so finessed, so exquisitely clever come into being all on its own? The problem of how and where life began is one of the great outstanding mysteries of science. Many investigators feel uneasy about stating in public that the origin of life is a mystery, even though behind closed doors they freely admit they are baffled. Here's Dr. George Whitesides, who has the highest Hirsch Index rating of any living chemist. The Hirsch Index is a rating of how many articles and how many times he's quoted and how many other people refer to him. He had one of the leading chemists in the world today. He's at Harvard University. Here's what he said in a speech when he accepted the Priestley Medal for chemistry in 2007. It's like the highest level of highest award you can get in science below a Nobel Prize. The Priestley Medal. He wrote like this. He said about the origin of life. He says, "How? I have no idea. On the basis of all chemistry I know, it seems astonishingly improbable." And the truth is, this is, in the book, I have 7 pages of quotes from the leading scientists in the world. They all say the same thing. And I'm just going to give you one more. Some of you might have, anyone who follows this subject, there was a conference at Arizona State University last month. They had deleted some of the greatest scientists in the world, including Richard Dawkins. It was on the origin of life. That was the name of the conference. I think the conference was called The Great Debate, Origins, 2011. Arizona State University. It was last month, so this is up to date. John Horgan, who's a senior writer for Scientific American, he wrote with them for 12 years. He has a column on the Scientific American online site. This is what he wrote after the conference. This is the headline of the article, okay? I don't even have to say what the article said. This is the headline. Psst, don't tell the creationists, but scientists don't have a clue how life began. You really don't have to say much more than that, okay? This is a month ago. Now, and by the way, he is not a believer. He says, well, we'll figure it out. So at the end of the article, he says, well, at least they're trying, okay? The religious people just say God did it, but at least the scientists are trying to figure it out. But in any case, so now, the origin of life scientists simply don't want to believe in God. They do not want there to be a creator. Why? We could speculate. Whether it's because somehow it makes them feel that they are inadequate as scientists, whether somehow they feel that religious fundamentalists will take over the world. I don't know what's driving them. But it is not a matter of science. It is a matter of desire. They don't want it to be true, and therefore it's not true. Let me give you a couple examples, and then we'll open it up to questions. In any case, Dr. Robert Shapiro, who happens to be one of the world leaders in origin of life research, he is professor emeritus of chemistry at New York University. This is what he says in his book. It's called Origins, A Skeptic's Guide to the Origin of Life. One favorite analogy of believers involves the discovery of a watch. We would not presume that this mechanism would come together from its parts by chance. It would function only if its components had been put together by a watchmaker. Similarly, the existence of bacteria and other living things, all of which are much more complex than a watch, implies the existence of a creator. He's talking about origin of life here, okay? He's a self-declared agnostic. Now, at this point, he almost sounds like Eli Shapiro, right? Listen carefully to the next line in the book. We will not take this escape route in our book, for we are committed to seeking an answer within the realm of science. He's committed. We're not going to take Jerry Coyne. Who here today heard of Dr. Jerry Coyne? Dr. Jerry Coyne is a very well-known atheistic biologist at the University of Chicago, a highly accomplished scientist. Now, when this article came out of the Huffington Post, he was kind of offended by what Rabbi Jacobs wrote, what I had said in my book, and on his blog, which is called Why Evolution is True, he took pot shots at me and Rabbi Jacobs. Oh, you know, how embarrassed he is that we're these fundamentalist crazy rabbis. He thought that Jews took science more seriously, etc. He said, I'm glad I'm a cultural Jew. Literally, he put a giant picture of a giant pastrami sandwich on his blog. I'm glad I'm a cultural Jew. And this is one of my favorite, delis where I could get there, a big pastrami sandwich. Anyway, okay. The point is that this man is a scientist, no question. He has impeccable scientific credentials. Listen to what he says at the end of his attack on me and Rabbi Jacobs. Here he sums up his arguments. Listen very carefully. And if anyone wants to look it up, they can look it up themselves. I'll give you where to look on the internet. Quote, no, we don't yet understand how life originated on Earth, but we have good leads, and abiogenesis, which means life from non-life, is a thriving field. And we may never understand how life originated on Earth because the traces of early life have vanished. We know it happened at least once, but not how. We know it happened at least once, but not how. I'm pretty confident that within, say, 50 years, we'll be able to create life in a laboratory under the conditions of primitive Earth. But that too won't tell us exactly how it did happen, only that it could. Now, how a scientist knows something happened, and then admit in the next sentence that he doesn't have any evidence that it did happen, is a mystery that only someone like Dr. Coyne obviously can understand, because I certainly don't understand. I want you to imagine going before a judge, a district attorney, and he says, Your Honor, I know the defendant is guilty. I know he's guilty. So he says, well, Your Honor, what's the evidence? Well, the evidence, don't worry. In 50 years, we're going to have lots of evidence. Now, can you imagine saying such? This is what he just said. We don't know, we're right, but I know it's true. And in 50 years, so, you know, 50 years, you know, we're both going to be, you know, Gary, did you find the answer yet? If that's if we're still around. Now, can you imagine that a scientist actually wrote such a thing? This is the same type of attitude. He does not realize even how ridiculous this is. And the weakness of his position obviously speaks for itself. Okay? And of course he accuses me of being anti-science. One more and then we'll stop. And this is from the like I said, the leader of atheism today, the most prominent atheist in the world, Richard Dawkins. Richard Dawkins, and this will be our final quote here. Richard Dawkins had debates regularly with believers, believing scientists. He had a very interesting debate with a Christian mathematician by the name of John Lennox. This was in October 2007. If you're into this stuff, Google Dawkins-Lennox debate. It was at the University of Alabama. Very fascinating to watch. This is what Richard Dawkins said at the debate. This is a verbatim quote. He said like this: I think that when you consider the beauty of the world, and you wonder how it came to be what it is, you are naturally overwhelmed with a feeling of awe, a feeling of admiration, and you almost feel a desire to worship something. I feel this. I recognize that other scientists, such as Carl Sagan, feel this. Einstein felt it. We, all of us, share a common kind of religious reverence for the beauties of the universe, for the complexity of life, for the sheer magnitude of the cosmos, for the sheer magnitude of geological time. And it's tempting to translate that feeling of awe and worship into a desire to worship some particular thing, a person, an agent. You want to attribute it to a maker, to a creator. This all sounds like Father Dawkins, right? Okay, so the question is, what stops him from taking that step? He means this. Richard Dawkins has an understanding of the living world that I certainly don't have. Maybe some of the doctors, the scientists in here do have that understanding. I don't. So then what stops him from worshiping his Creator? And he says, in his own words, what science has now achieved is an emancipation from that impulse to attribute these things to a Creator. It was a supreme achievement of the human intellect to realize there was a better explanation, that these things can come about by purely natural causes. We understand essentially how life came into being. We understand essentially how life came into being. Does everybody remember the old joke about Tonto and the Lone Ranger? Tonto and the Lone Ranger are surrounded by Indians, and the Lone Ranger says to Tonto, Tonto, what are we going to do? We are surrounded by Indians. And Tonto says, who's we, paleface? Right? We understand essentially how life came into being. Who's we, paleface? Is it Dr. Stuart Kaufman, who said that if anyone who says they know is a fool or a knave? Right? Was it Dr. George Whitesides, the one who said that, how? I have no idea. It seems to be astonishingly improbable. Who knows? Is it Richard Dawkins himself? And Richard Dawkins was interviewed in a movie by Ben Stein called Expelled, No Intelligence Allowed. That was on the subject of this talk. Here's the interview. Ben Stein. Well, how did it start? Dawkins. Nobody knows how it started. We know the kind of event it must have been. We know the sort of event that must have happened for the origin of life. Stein, what was that? Dawkins, it was the origin of the first self-replicating molecule. Stein, how did that happen? Dawkins, I told you I don't know. Stein, so you have no idea how it started? Dawkins, no, nor does anyone else. It is only the fact that he is able to live this self-deluding view of reality. And this is in the book. I give example after example